floor is yours.
Okay. So yeah, so I'm still John Kelsey, just like the last 2 times I've introduced myself. So this is work. This is still kind of half done, right? This is not finished yet. This is work I've been doing mostly with Aish, she was a PhD student at University of Maryland. She just graduated and moved over to UCSB as a postdoc, and then also with John Katz and Dana. And so I'm trying to get a the big picture here is 2 different constructions. They're generic hash constructions. So you take an existing fixed length hash function and you plug it into this construction and get something else out of it. And the first one is about parallel hashing. The second one is about making a variable length output hash. Okay, and the goal ultimately is to make a standard, but also to write an academic paper about this. And one big difference between the way that I personally, and actually mostly NIST, has done this sort of development in the past is as I'm working on the design here, I'm trying to incorporate, and I'm thinking about the security proof at the same time. I'm not really a proof person, I'm actually a cryptanalyst, but I'm trying to learn how to think like a proof person as well, and it's been really educational trying to do this. So I've learned a huge amount on this project. So let's talk about the problems we're trying to solve. The first problem is parallel hashing of long messages. If you have a very long message, well, basically, it's going to take a long time to hash because almost all of the standard hashing constructions are inherently sequential, right? So this is Merkle-Damgard, which is the way like SHA-2, SHA-256, and SHA-512 are built. And the idea is you take an input message, you break it into sequential n-bit chunks, m-bit chunks, and you pad it, right? You have to pad it unambiguously out to an integer multiple of m, of little m. And then you feed those one at a time to this function. So you start with an initial value that is just defined as the starting value, and then you already know what Merkle-Damgard looks like. So you process first the first message block, then the next one, then the next one. Well, you might notice you have to have the result of processing the first message block before you can start on the second one, right? So this is inherently sequential. Right? There's no nice way to do this in parallel. And actually, if you look at a sponge construction, it has a similar property. Like Ketchak, it has a similar property. You have to process the first block before you can process the second block. So the reason we care about this is Moore's law at some point kind of turns sideways. So for a long time, God, this is one of those when I was your age things, right? For a long time, like when I was young and you were like really small, clock speeds were increasing, right? So you could do the same set of steps faster every couple of years. You buy a new computer, and the same sequential set of steps would take like half as much time as it did the previous couple of years, because the clock speeds were increasing. And that's pretty much stopped. The clock speeds have stopped increasing. Sometimes the sequential operations get a little bit faster because the processors do more clever things to try to arrange how the operations are taken care of internally. But really, the processors aren't getting much faster. So now what you get is, instead of having a much faster processor, you just have more processors. You have like a big graphics unit where you have multiple cores, where you have multi-threading, so you do more things in parallel. But the problem is that doesn't really work very well with this sequential hashing, right? So we'd like to exploit all this parallelism, the vector instructions, the multi-threading, and multiple cores. We'd like to exploit that to speed up hashing. So we already did a standard on this, SB 800-185, and this defines variants of Ketchak that do several things, but one of them is a fast tree hash. It's a depth 1 tree hash. So basically, it's intended just to speed up parallel processing of hashing. So, yeah. So, along with wanting to speed up the hash, make the hash run faster in parallel, there are a few other things we might like. One of the things we would like is we want it to run faster if you've got more resources, right? But we don't want to screw over the low end, right? So we don't want to have some system that can't do things in parallel at all suddenly pay this huge performance penalty or just not be able to compute the function. That'd be really bad. We also don't want to bind the architecture of the machine that originally computes this hash function into the parameters of how the parallel hash is done. So you wouldn't want to set the situation up so that when I originally compute the hash, I can do 8-way parallelism, and then anybody who can't do 8-way parallelism doesn't feel like they pay a penalty for trying to hash this thing. So we also wanted to add a couple of other things. We would like variable length output, and I'm going to handle that in this other thing called expand I'm going to talk about a little bit later. And also we want a customization string. So customization strings also are in 185. What's a customization string? It's an optional string, it can just be the empty string, right? So you don't have to use it. And the goal is to do domain separation. So you think about what's a function, you remember a domain and a range, right? Domain is the input, range is the output. So domain separation means I separate out the function, so the set of inputs into the underlying hash function, I separate them out so that different applications get different parts of that space. And that means they're like entirely different functions, okay? And so if I want to use a hash for a key fingerprint, and I also want to use a hash for a signature, and also maybe for a Mac, I would like those to be distinct, so that it's like when I'm using 3 different functions. Often in protocols, you'll see somebody who needs this sort of functionality, and they'll do it by saying, well, I'm going to prepend a 0 byte to the first time I use the hash function and a 1 byte the second time, something like that. So this is a more generic way of doing it, and I don't know for sure whether people will pick this up and start using it a lot. It feels like a very useful feature, so we included it in 185. I'd like to also include it in these functions. So this brings us to shape. And this is a picture, and this picture actually tells you pretty much how this thing works. Okay? So let's talk about shape. So shape is a generic parallel hashing construction. It works with any fixed length hash function. And although I have to say, I'm really thinking in terms of SHA-256 and SHA-512, because those are existing NIST standards that are fixed length hash functions, right? So we have basically two sets of hashing standards. Now we have SHA-3 and SHA-2, and we would like SHA-2 to be able to do these things that we just figured out how to make SHA-3 do, like getting fast parallel hashing. So I'm mainly thinking about SHA-2 and SHA-256 and 512, but really I want this to be a drop-in for anything. So if you've got any good hash function that you're comfortable with, you should be able to drop it in. The goal here for security is that it's no less secure than the underlying hash function, right? This is pretty obvious. You don't want to say I'm using SHA-256 here, but really this thing is breakable. You like to be able to show that it's not weaker. And also for performance, the goal is sort of benefit from parallelism, but don't penalize people who don't have as much ability to do parallel hashing as you do. So this is a pseudocode definition. So I know this looks just beautiful, but well, you can see this. This actually isn't very useful. Let's look at the picture, because the picture tells you a lot more. So what we're going to do, first of all, we have these 2 inputs. The B is the leaf size. It's a parameter that says basically how big are these chunks that we're going to break the message into. And S is the customization string. So we're going to encode these in an unambiguous way, because if you don't do your encoding right, then you screw up your collision resistance. So we're going to encode these in an intelligent way, and we're going to hash B and S together, and that's going to be the first hash output that goes up into this second level. And then we're going to take the message and we're going to split it into B byte chunks. Okay, so if it's a million bytes and we're doing 1,000 byte chunks, then we would just break it into 1,000 chunks, right? The last chunk might be less than B bytes. Everything else is going to be exactly B bytes. So we're going to break it up, and we're going to pass each one of those into the hash function. Remember, we're not doing the compression function here. We're calling the actual hash. So if we put SHA-2 in here, this is SHA-256, SHA-256, SHA-256 all the way across. Okay, and we get these outputs. We concatenate them. Okay, so 256-bit output each time. We're going to concatenate them all together, and then we're going to pass that final concatenated thing into SHA-256 again to get our final shape output. Okay, so this is pretty straightforward. It's exactly what I said. It's a depth 1 tree, right? It's a hash tree, but it's only one. There's only one layer. So remember, our goals here are, really our performance goals. We want very little overhead. So if somebody has to do this sequentially, we don't want it to kill them, right? We don't want to have something where they pay some huge penalty. We want to benefit from parallelism, but we want to be agnostic with respect to how, like to the exact amount of parallelism that somebody has, right? And then kind of have these questions: how much overhead do we have? How much speed up? How much? How do we choose leaf size? And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So, kind of the big picture, when we look at sequential computation, you can see this with the picture. So we always are doing at least one extra hash operation for this first thing with the customization string and the leaf size. If you're just hashing it with SHA-256, you never would have done that. There's always at least one more compression. If we're doing, let's say we're thinking about SHA-256, there'd always be at least one more compression function call there, and at least one more for this final step. So we always have to pay at least a little bit of overhead, right? At least 2 compression function calls, and for memory, we wind up needing two hashing contexts instead of just one, or enough memory to store 2 hashing states. So I'm going to give you some tables for performance. I want to say up front, these are not performance measurements. These are estimates, right? Based on basically counting compression function calls. One of my coworkers, I don't say his name right, Chadash, is working on implementations and was implemented some of this and tried to give us some performance numbers. He's still working on that. So I don't have hard performance numbers for you. This is all based on counting, right? So if you just look at the number of compression function calls here, you can see when we set the, I think this is all for, this is for a very short leaf size, for 4 kilobyte leaf size. It should be very short. It's actually too short to get good parallel speed up. But if you did this, you would see that even for like a 32 kilobyte message, you're not actually paying much overhead. Hashing it with SHA-256 is only going to be about 3% slower than hashing it with shape. Or sorry, hashing it with shape is going to be about 3% slower than hashing it with SHA-256 if you do everything sequentially. Okay, so once you get beyond just really silly small messages, you shouldn't use this parallel hashing thing to hash like packets, right? That would be silly. But once you get past that size, you're not paying much overhead to do this parallel thing rather than doing the sequential thing. So when we think about the parallel speed up, one of the things we want to think about here is there's no real possibility of a mismatch between the sender and the receiver. There are a whole bunch of ways to build tree hashing modes, and in some of them you sort of burn in some of the architecture of the original sender or the original person who calculated the hash, and you say, okay, if you can't do 8-way parallelism by your SIMD instructions, then you're not going to get the speed up. And we really wanted to avoid that. So there's no dependency on, there's no mismatch between the sender and the receiver. Everybody gets whatever they've got. The limit to the speed up, really the main limit to the speed up that you get from doing this in parallel is the sequential step at the end, right? So you can do all this first layer in parallel, but then you've got to deal with it sequentially at the end. And that's, that's the limit. That's the thing that, this is the difference between doing just like a straight Merkle tree where it would be like a binary tree all the way down. Then you wouldn't have that limit. But on the other hand, you'd have a lot of other issues with overhead. So in all of these things, these are computed. And what I've done, the assumption I've made, let me jump back a step. The assumption I've made here to compute these is that all the parallel hashing all happens on that first layer. I don't assume that last sequential hash, that the hash of the sequential stuff at the end, I don't assume that there's any parallelism there, right? So I assume that that's done after all the hashing of the top level is done. The reason I'm assuming that is because my understanding is from some conversations I've had with people is that the fastest way you're going to speed this up on modern machines is probably going to be to do SIMD instructions, right? So you're doing the sort of vector instructions where you stack maybe 4 hash states together in the registers, and then you do all the hash functions together. And if you were doing that, there just doesn't seem to be any. It seems very easy to see how you would do this thing where you would hash all these little blocks and these big b-byte blocks in parallel. It doesn't seem possible at all to synchronize that with sequentially hashing the things that were coming out of it. So I feel like I want to make a very conservative estimate here. So how much speed up do we expect? This is something that's kind of interesting to look at. So if we have just a 4 kilobyte leaf size, right, which is very small, then we don't really get as much advantage of speed or like as much improvement in the performance from parallel hashing as we would expect. And in fact, we seem to top out, right? So the longer the message, in general, the bigger the impact is going to be of the parallelism. But if you're only using these very small leaf sizes, you top out at about 42, factor of 42 speed up, right? That is, if you have, you have lots of, you have 64-way parallelism, so you should be able to speed up by a factor of 64 in an ideal world. You're really stuck at only about a 42 speed up, and the reason why is exactly because of the sequential step, right? So if you have very small leaf sizes, then you're making this, you're doing a whole lot of these, and you're getting a really long input to this last hash function. That's why it's slowing down. So once you make the leaf size bigger, though, 64 kilobytes or 1 megabyte, then you wind up, you kind of asymptotically approach some limit of how much speed up you can get. But the maximum speed up is actually quite a bit closer to the maximum you can imagine. Like 60. If we only got 62, a factor of 62 speed up, that'd be great. Now, I want to be clear again. This is calculated, not experimental, and it's entirely possible that there will be reasons why we don't get anything like this performance in practice, because sometimes you might have like contention for memory resources, something like that, right? So I'm hoping in the not too distant future to have hard numbers for this. Right now, this is what I've got. So with a big leaf size and long enough messages, we get, at least based on this calculation, we get really good speed ups. That's nice, right? And we don't depend on knowing anything about the other side. So if one person does this calculation and they have 64-way parallelism, and the other person has to check the hash function and they have 8-way parallelism, they just get, each one of them gets about what they, one of them gets 8-way speed up, and one of them gets 64-way speed up. So, yeah, I think I've already covered that. So the most important thing that we figured out here just by looking at this is that the leaf size actually needs to be fairly big. It's kind of it'll kill you to have these tiny leaf sizes, because then you get that long sequential hash at the end. So let me see where I am. Okay. So let's talk about security. So shape is always built on top of some underlying hash function. SHA-256 being the one that I'm thinking about most of the time. But it could be some other thing. It could be RIPE MD160, or it could be, I don't know, one of the Havels. There are like a zillion variants of Havel, right? I don't know if all of them are broken or just most. But it could be any number of things, right? And so what we want to do is we want to say, whatever hash function you put in here, if that hash function is good, then so is shape, right? And we'd also, I guess I should say, we'd also like to resist length extension attacks even when the hash function doesn't. So suppose I give you a collision for shape, right? The claim I will make, and it's easy to demonstrate why this is true, if you give me a collision for shape, I can always produce a collision for the underlying hash function, right? So this is sort of an easy way of making an argument that says shape is just as collision resistant as the underlying hash. Because if you ever find a collision for shape, you've also automatically found a collision for the underlying hash. So if I use SHA-256 in here, and you find an algorithm that lets you find collisions for shape SHA-256, then you can just use that to find collisions for SHA-256. So if you want to think about why that is, kind of the big picture here. Let's suppose there are about 3 ways this can happen. So suppose I've created a collision in shape by just tweaking like the customization string or something. Okay, so S and S star will change. In that case, one of 2 things must be true. If I've got a collision in shape, right, then either I've got a collision from that first hash function, the one in yellow, or I've got a collision in the green one. If the yellowed hash function doesn't give me a collision, I've got 2 different inputs and 1 output there, then I found a collision right there in the customization string being hashed. If not, then this input to the final hash has to be different. And in that case, I've got a collision there. So you can kind of see why, at least if we have a collision in the customization string or the leaf size, that must translate into a collision. If that lets us get a collision on shape, then we need to get a collision on the underlying hash. The thing that's probably more interesting is what happens if I change the message. So I change the input message. I have two different input messages. And these two input messages are different, but I get the same output from shape. In this case, I'm going to assume that B and S are the same for both of these. And so let's see what happens, right? There must be a first block into which this change occurs, right? If that block, if there's a difference in that block, the one that's shown in the yellow hash, either we have two different input blocks for that hash that give the same output, in which case that's our collision, or they're different and then we've got a collision down here on the green, right? So once again, we can see if there's a collision in shape, we get a collision in SHA-1, or in SHA-226. Collision in SHA-1 wouldn't be as exciting, but somebody already did that. So a very similar argument, actually it's a much simpler argument, says that preimages also work this way. If you give me an algorithm where I ask you for a shape preimage of 0 and you hand it to me, well, it's pretty easy to see, since the shape output is just the output of a hash, if you give me that input, I can go compute exactly what it was, and now I've found a preimage of 0 for the underlying hash, right? So it's a very straightforward thing to see. If there's an algorithm for finding preimages for shape, then there's also one for finding preimages for the underlying hash. Second preimage, the analysis is a little bit more complicated, but you also, as long as you limit the input length of these things, then even for like something like Merkle dam guard that allows long message second preimage attacks, you get the same result. So the last thing that I was thinking about with shape, the last security issue is length extension attacks. And the sort of question here is, length extension attacks do work on Merkle dam guard. So you might want to say, why wouldn't they work on shape? And they don't work on shape. And the reason is actually this little 0, these n/2 bits of 0 at the end. So what's going on here? Well, if you think about a length extension attack, obviously none of them would work on this first layer of hashes because you don't see the output. On the second one, in order to get a length extension attack to work, you basically have to you first see the hash of the first message and then give me a second message that has the right padding at the end for that first message, and then you can extend it. But in this case, to get the right padding, you would actually have to force the this hash value of the last block to give the last n/2 bits to be 0. Okay, that's to the n/2 attack. That's actually the security level we're shooting for with this. So we can bound the difficulty of length extension attacks just by sticking these extra n/2 bits of 0. And it turns out for SHA-226 this would actually never be a problem because the way the blocks line up, but you can't always guarantee that would be the case. That's why you need the n/2 bits. So an issue that we have, in general, and this is something for the parallel hash in SP 800-185, is we have this leaf size issue, where we have the leaf size is completely flexible. It could be anything. And there's an issue there with interoperability, and also, if you choose a really small one, you get crappy performance. So one of the things that we've thought about here is maybe giving only a very small number of selections for the leaf size. The kind of interesting problem here is if you choose B, it does let you tune your shape performance to the amount of parallelism you get. And that gives you a performance advantage, but at the same time it kind of contradicts the whole goal we have of saying don't set up your hash so that the person doing the original hash chooses the parameters to make his stuff fast and everybody else's stuff slower. But in general, let's look at this picture here. If you think about the block size getting bigger, you still don't pay any big performance penalty. So if you imagine that you're trying to do this hashing sequentially, even if you make very large blocks, you're really just going to go through the message one, like sequentially process each block in turn and then just keep the extra hashing context around. So you won't, if you have really large blocks, that's not going to slow down a sequential implementation. So the goal, kind of the wrap up here with shape, it's intended to be a generic parallel hashing algorithm. Security should be as good as the underlying hash function. It gets this big speed up for parallel processing and it doesn't pay much of a cost. We are working still on trying to do indifferentiability proof for this. We're pretty far along on that, but we're not done, so I'm not going to try to show you half-baked stuff. The second problem, which is kind of a different problem, but if you see the shakes in FIPS 202, right, the stuff derived from Ketchak, they give you variable length outputs, and variable length outputs are really useful. Okay. Actually, if you look around, in a lot of protocols or a lot of implementations, you'll see someplace where I have a 256-bit hash function and I need 300 bits. And so people do something like this, and they often don't think it through real well, and they haven't really analyzed it. There also are a lot of standards where people have had to roll their own way of expanding from a hash output to lots of bits. So every KDF in the world has this, and some of them kind of screw it up. There's OAEP that does this for the padding for inside of RSA. You see some other places like where people do this, and hopefully in those cases they've at least thought about what they're doing. But this is a general problem it's very useful to have a solution that's built into your primitive instead of a solution that you're supposed to somehow come up with and roll your own. So, like I said, we have the shakes, and they do this. But this doesn't work for existing hash functions, right? It doesn't work if you want to use SHA-2 and have variable length output. So once again, we like a lot of things. We would like, ideally, it would be nice if changing the output length would change the output string. There's a sort of property with shakes that that doesn't happen. It's like it's basically conceptually there's an infinite length string and you just take as many bits as you need. And that's good in some applications, but it's also kind of a surprising bit of functionality. You can imagine a designer messing himself up with that. It would be cool to have random access to the output string too. Might be nice. It would be nice to have the customization string incorporated. So these are some things that we've incorporated here into Expand. So this is the picture of Expand, and once again, kind of from the picture, you're able to see what's going on. So, let me see here. So, again, this is a generic way. You take any fixed length hash function and you can turn it into a variable length hash function. It'll work with anything. So, even though I'm thinking SHA-56, SHA-512, I'm going to do it with Tiger or something, that's okay. Anything that's a fixed length function will work. You could, in principle, use it with SHA-3, with the SHA-3 functions, which are fixed length functions derived from Ketchak, but that would be kind of perverse, because there's already a defined variable length thing for it. Again, we claim the security should be just as good as the underlying hash function. The performance, it's nice if you can benefit from parallelism, but don't penalize anything. It's less of an issue here because, with shape we're actually addressing the problem that people might have a very long input message and need to hash it. It's maybe a little less of an urgent thing that people often need to generate a zillion bits output from their hash, but maybe sometimes that's an issue. So this is the pseudocode. The pseudocode probably doesn't tell you a whole lot. So let's just go back to the picture. The picture is the one that is easy to understand. And there's nothing very complicated here, right? So essentially we're taking the input, V is the input string, L is the maximum allowed output length for this thing, and S is the customization string. We do some encoding, because once again you can't let fields get slid around. If you don't encode things right, then you mess up your collision resistance. So we do some encoding and we get a hash output. And then we use that as essentially like sort of a key for running the hash function in counter mode, right? So each of these n-bit chunks here is going, it's the same left half of the input into the hash, and then the right half is a counter that runs from 0 to t-1. So you can immediately see, how this works. You get parallel, you could run this in parallel and get a big speed up if that were important to you. And this is also, I should say, This is very closely related to in 890 in the DRBG standard. There's a function called hash DRBG, and this is very closely related to hash DRBG. It's more or less the same functionality, but without the surrounding stuff to do all the the seeding and reseeding and stuff. So it's also possible to do random access, and this is pseudocode that will give you random access to this string, right? So in other words, instead of just saying give me 1,000,000 bits from this string, you can say, let's imagine that you can say I want access to a 1,000,000-bit string, but give me bits 5,000 to 10,000 the output. And this is not terribly hard to do. The pseudocode is there and it's not too hard to follow. But really, you can just see, right? Because this is all just counter mode, you can decide. You just have to figure out where your counters needs to be. You start your counter there and you run it until you're done, until you've generated the bits you need, and then you just hand them back, right? So one reason why we wanted to give random access is because of a sort of an interesting problem trying to do the indifferentiability proof here, where we noticed that the attacker could request a lot of bits from the simulator that the simulator would have to produce without actually having to do it, where the attacker didn't have to do any work. So if you have a variable length primitive, then an attacker can keep hitting your simulator and say, give me 1,000,000 bits, and in some sense it feels like that's letting the attacker make the simulator do way more work than the attacker does. So it seems like a bad thing for the proof. So the implementation of performance, there's nothing super hard here. It's easy to implement, obviously. I've implemented these both in Python. And Chadash has done a parallel implementation of Shape. I don't think he's done Expand yet, but Shape's the one that actually performance testing is more important. It supports random access, which is potentially kind of cool. Security here is kind of the same sort of arguments that I was making for Shape, but it's probably even easier to see here. If hash is a good hash function, then expand should be a good hash function. And you kind of see this here. So once again, collisions, if I give you a collision for expand, you can always find a collision for hash. And you can see why this has to be true. Just think about the first n bits of output, right? Well, if you give me two different inputs, two different values of v, say, that give me the same expand output, well, there has to have been a collision either in that top level or that bottom, right? And it's pretty easy to see why that has to be true. So this is actually much simpler to see than the Shape stuff. We have the same property that if there are collisions in expand, they immediately become collisions in the underlying hash function. Pre-images, it's the same argument. It's actually super easy to see. Just give me a pre-image, ask for a pre-image, and on that first n bits, it's got to be a pre-image of the hash. In general, the pre-image stuff is very easy because the outputs are all from a hash function. So, some other security analysis. Second pre-image attacks are no easier on expand than they are on hash. Length extension attacks are hopeless there. There's just no place for them to go. If you want to see that, let me pop back up here. You can see that there's basically no variability in the length of the inputs to the hashes in the second level. And the ones in the second level are the only ones where the attacker ever sees the output. So there's no way for a length extension attack to even work. So we're working on an indifferentiability proof. And mainly this means I've been learning about indifferentiability proofs because this is a very different world than I've usually lived in. So we're doing this as a special pub because we think this is useful. We're trying to do this as a special pub because I think this is useful. We kind of talked about Shape a long time ago as being some sort of parallel hashing mode that we would come out with. And so I think it's worth doing. And the expand, I think, is a very useful functionality. Now, this is probably of interest to nobody in the world but me, or but people at NIST. But we've traditionally written our documents in Word. I don't know if any of you have ever done math-heavy documents with equations in Word, but but it's like dental work, but not so nice. And especially when you're sharing among multiple people and everybody has slightly different versions, it's basically like, you know, a full employment act for whoever sells beer in your town. So one of the other things that's very different about this relative to previous work of this kind that we've done is from the beginning we've been incorporating the idea of security proofs, wanting to know what could we actually prove about this, thinking in terms of the indifferentiability proof, rather than, you know, it's been common for NIST before to produce things, either take something that's already been produced or produce something that it looks secure and we ask for public comment, but we often have not had a proof, and then maybe some years later somebody comes up with a proof, or maybe an attack, hopefully a proof. So that's the big picture. This is kind of a shorter talk than my others. Maybe everybody's tired after the long day or the long week. But shape gives you generic parallel hashing. Span gives you generic variable length hashing. And we're working on the proofs and on a draft SP. We're basically going to try to write an academic paper with the proofs and then the special pub, because putting proofs in a special publication would be silly. None of the people who care about the special pub are going to read the proofs. So that's everything. So thanks a lot.